The I-14 arrived at Truk on August 4th, and for the first time in 3 weeks, her crew set foot on dry land. Shimizu was happy to have escaped the Allied dragnet and immediately sent a message to 6th Fleet headquarters relaying his arrival. Unfortunately, Truk was not what he'd expected. What had once been the Empire's premier forward naval base was now a shambles. The harbour was filled with sunken ships, and the skeletons of burned-out planes littered the airfield. Those who had known Truk in its glory days could only weep at its destruction. If this was what an island looked like when the enemy bypassed it, what was in store for Japan? Under the circumstances, Shimizu's arrival was nothing short of miraculous. The I-14 should have been lying at the bottom of the ocean, a gaping hole blown in her side, but Shimizu had run the Allied gauntlet. Arizumi's snorkel may have had something to do with it. Still, Shimizu was not just lucky, he was competent as well. As soon as the I-14 docked at Truk, her crew sprang into action. First, they unloaded the 2 Scion aircraft. Next, the planes were assembled and flown over Ulithi. That same day, Arizumi received orders for another mission. It seemed premature to plan a second attack before the first one had launched, but the Imperial Japanese Navy was running out of combat units. After the I-400 and I-401 sent their Siran against United States carriers, the Sentoku force was to travel to Hong Kong and pick up a new 10-plane squadron. After refueling in Singapore, they would then return to Ulithi for a second attack. A contingent from the 631st had already been dispatched by submarine to help with preparations. Given Ulithi's heavy security, the odds the I-401 would survive the first mission were slim at best. A second attack had only a 1 in a million chance. It was not being outnumbered that put them at risk as much as a top-secret United States intelligence operation called Ultra, which had broken the Imperial Japanese Navy's naval codes. The Imperial Japanese Navy's High Command refused to believe their codes had been compromised, but United States naval intelligence knew the whereabouts of virtually every remaining Japanese submarine. Fortunately, Arizumi's sub-captains had maintained radio silence since leaving Ominato. There were a few exceptions, such as Shimizu's message confirming his arrival at Truk, but by and large, the Sentoku subs were absent from the airwaves, which made it harder to find them. Arizumi was not out of touch with headquarters, though. 6th Fleet communications were still broadcast, and the subs picked them up at night when they surfaced. Receiving a radio signal was far different from sending one, though. It did not betray a sub's location. Radio silence, then, was an important reason Nambu had made it this far. It also maintained the crucial element of surprise. While the 631st readied 10 Siran for transport, Asamura worried about the combat readiness of his pilots. Sub-crews were kept busy with myriad tasks. Even the Siran maintenance workers had plenty to do, but Siran pilots and their observers had no assigned duties on board the sub. As days passed, Asamura worried they were losing their edge. In truth, Siran air crews were nothing more than high-priority passengers being transported to launch coordinates. Other than maintaining careful watch over their aircraft, they had little to occupy them. Regardless, the I-401's crew treated them like gods. Though it was good for morale, Asamura worried that 3 weeks of inactivity would hurt pilot readiness. The pilots had lost their appetite, for one thing. They subsisted mainly on canned spinach, soy sauce, and ginger, hardly the breakfast of champions. Lack of exercise was another problem. The I-401 might have been big, but it was so crammed with men and supplies that the Siran pilots spent most of the day either lying in their bunks or hanging around the radio shack. Asamura passionately believed that the Arashi mission was their last chance for heroic achievement, so he decided to do what he did best: impose a strict regimen. One of the first things Asamura did was have his pilots assigned to lookout duty. Searching for the enemy in darkness was one way to keep night-flying skills sharp. Asamura did not want to rely solely upon a special hormone designed to improve night vision that would be injected before the attack. He also had his pilots rehearse takeoff procedures while sitting in the cockpit and held mission briefings using photos and a scale model of Ulithi's anchorage. Finally, he initiated a calisthenics program, held on deck, to keep his men in shape. It is not unusual in Japan to drill men to the point where fatigue is a greater impediment to success than lack of preparedness. This was not the case for Takahashi. He had it easy aboard the I-400. When he grew tired of lying in his bunk, he would go to the radio room and listen to the broadcasts out of Sydney. Sometimes he'd chat with the communications officer. Despite the effort to fill his days, Takahashi still had plenty of time to think. One memory he may have avoided was the atrocities he'd committed while serving aboard the I-37. It was February 22nd, 1944, when one of the I-37's lookouts spotted the British Chivalry, an unescorted grain carrier sailing between Melbourne and Abadan. The I-37 sank the merchant using a combination of torpedoes and deck gun fire. When the Chivalry was gone, her lifeboats were beckoned and the ship's captain ordered on board the sub. Takahashi had held a pistol while the captain was interrogated. He had also relieved him of a briefcase full of jewels. Takahashi knew Submarine Squadron Ron 8's policy was to execute survivors of ships they'd sunk. For justification, he was told Japanese women and children had been indiscriminately annihilated during the invasion of Saipan. The lifeboats were too close for the sub's machine guns to be used effectively, so combat rifles were issued. Takahashi used his sidearm instead. At least 13 men were dead and 5 wounded. The I-37 sank 2 more British merchants after that, annihilating their crews in a similar manner. If Takahashi felt regret, he did not express it. Even the Butcher was penitent. As Ulithi drew closer, the Siran pilots grew increasingly sentimental. Knowing their days were numbered, they dwelled in the past even as they drilled operational details into their heads. One of the popular songs of the era, Cherry Blossom Classmates, or Doki no Sakura, perfectly captures their mindset. The song celebrates the friendship of 2 former classmates, now naval aviators destined to die in battle. Few things represent the Japanese view of life better than cherry blossoms, and the song expresses the wistfulness many Japanese feel about life's beautiful and transitory nature. You and I, blossoms of the same cherry tree, that bloomed in the Naval Academy's garden, blossoms know they must blow in the wind someday, blossoms in the wind, fallen for their country. You and I, blossoms of the same cherry tree, that bloomed in the flight school garden, I wanted us to fall together just as we have sworn to do. Oh, why did you have to die and fall before me? You and I, blossoms of the same cherry tree, though we fall far away from one another, we will bloom together in Yasukuni Shrine. Spring will find us again, blossoms of the same cherry tree. In addition to being sentimental, the absurdly young Siran pilots were not above wearing good luck charms. Their talisman of choice was the Seninbari, or stitches by 1,000 people. The Seninbari was a plain cotton wrapper worn like a cummerbund around the stomach. Designed to ward off harm, it was made by a man's mother, wife, or sister. The custom had been around since the Meiji era and was hugely popular. Even in the summer of 1945, women could be found on street corners politely asking passers-by to contribute a stitch. When 1,000 stitches were collected, the Seninbari was ready to be worn. The day after Arizumi received instructions for a second attack, the I-400 passed east of Saipan. It was just before dawn the morning of August 5th, and the sub had recently finished charging her batteries. Shortly after Kusaka submerged, a malfunction in the maneuvering room's electrical distribution panel caused it to catch fire. Sparks shot everywhere as the board began to burn. Moments later, the power went out. Fire is the worst condition that a closed system like a sub can face underwater. It cannot vent smoke, precious oxygen is consumed, and the air is soon poisoned. Kusaka ordered the maneuvering room's hatches shut and closed the I-400's ventilation system, but noxious fumes had already spread. His next action was to surface. Unfortunately, the morning sun revealed a United States task force on the horizon, so Kusaka had no choice but to submerge again. This time the I-400 descended out of control, forcing her crew to grab hold of anything they could find while the sub sank by the stern. When a gauge showed them passing their safety depth, many feared the worst. The blackout only compounded Kusaka's problems. Without bilge pumps, which require electricity to operate, water built up in the maneuvering room. The water not only risked shorting out additional equipment, it was pulling the I-400 down at a steep angle. Fortunately, Captain Kusaka regained control before his sub reached crush depth, but they were hardly out of trouble. As the United States Task Force steamed overhead, the I-400 slowly began to expire. It's hard to know which was worse, to die from asphyxiation or at the hands of a United States warship. Without ventilation, however, the temperature inside the sub soared, while the dimness of the emergency lights only added to the oppression. The air was so noxious, the crew's eyes burned, their throats became sore, and many developed headaches. Those men who were not on duty took to their bunks to consume as little oxygen as possible. It took more than 5 hours to complete the repairs. Time passed so slowly, they must have felt they were already dead. By the time repairs were finished, the I-400's oxygen had almost run out. Kusaka was not sure whether the task force was still around, but he had to surface. When the I-400 broke through the waves, he was relieved to find the ocean clear. Meanwhile, the I-401 had also met the enemy. In fact, Nambu had encountered so many United States warships, he was forced to submerge up to 10 times a day. This meant the detour Arizumi had ordered was taking longer than anticipated. Unfortunately, there was nothing Nambu could do about it. Everywhere they went, an unbroken line of United States warships steamed toward Japan. Though it added time to their overburdened schedule, Nambu did his best to evade them. One morning, Nambu bade Yata, his chief gunnery officer, to the conning tower to look through the periscope. "Hey, shooter," Nambu called, using Yata's nickname. "Look here. We could sink any of these ships with a single shot." Nambu knew the I-401 had to remain concealed. Molops had taught him restraint meant survival, but it was frustrating just to watch. When Kusaka heard that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan, he was more concerned about missing his rendezvous than about the devastation. Because of the delays, his rendezvous with Nambu had been pushed back. But when Kusaka surfaced at the location after sunset, August 13th, the I-401 was nowhere to be seen. Undaunted, Kusaka remained on the surface, expecting to receive the I-401's identification signal at any moment. When dawn approached and the I-401 still had not appeared, he began to worry. Kusaka could have radioed his commander, but to do so might have given away his position. One thing he could not do was remain on the surface. The area was swarming with enemy ships, and if their sharp eyes did not spot him, their radar would the I-400 prepared to submerge. Kusaka hoped the I-401 was just delayed, but his chief navigator jumped to the more obvious conclusion. "Either I have made a navigational error, or the I-401 has been sunk," he told Kusaka. Unfortunately, after double-checking his calculations, the chief navigator concluded they were in the right place. That left only one explanation. The I-401 had been destroyed. The first indication that something unusual was happening came a few days before the Segundo left Midway on her 5th and final war patrol. A United States carrier strike against Japan's third-largest island was suddenly called off on August 5th. Additionally, Admiral Lockwood had been told to pull back his submarines at least 100 miles from Kyushu's coast. This was strange, considering United States forces had done nothing for the past year except press closer to Japan. If Lockwood's subs were being withdrawn, something big was up. 5 days later, on Captain Johnson's 30th birthday, the Segundo departed Midway. Several officers had been lost to crew rotation during the sub's month-and-a-half layover. New arrivals included Lieutenant Junior Grade C.A. Hennessy, Ensign R.S. Byers, and QM3C Carlo Michael Carlucci. Nevertheless, more than half the sub's original crew remained on board since her commissioning. Among them were the sub's executive officer, Lieutenant John Silent Joe Bolson, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Lewis Rodney Johnson. Chief of the boat, Edward A. Russell, had also been with the sub since the beginning, as had Chiefs Carl Stalkop and J.T. Doggy Downs. Together, these 6 men had 30 war patrols under their belts. When you added 7 more for Captain Johnson, the total was nearly 40. Whatever the crew might have thought of their medal-waving captain, the Segundo was a well-seasoned boat. Lieutenant Bolson was not bothered by the recent change in command. He knew sub-captains came and went with regularity. It was always better to learn how a new skipper liked things done when he joined a boat, and if his eccentricities rubbed you the wrong way, well, a smart executive officer kept it to himself. Bolson certainly knew how to keep things to himself. He was not nicknamed Silent Joe for nothing. Unfortunately, the other officers on board did not always share this attitude. As the Segundo departed midway, the grumbling continued. Carlo Carlucci noticed his captain had a mouth on him right away. This was really saying something, since Carlucci was no shrinking violet when it came to colourful language. Everything was this and that, he recalled about his skipper. It did not bother Carlucci. He was new to the boat and had no expectations of how his captain should behave. But a foul-mouthed sub-captain suggested a degree of volatility uncommon in a line commander. It was not a good sign. Carlucci was a tough guy himself. A D's, dem and dose type, he could have been mistaken for a boxer or a longshoreman. Born and raised in New York City, he had worked construction before the war and was 175 pounds of solid muscle. He was also scared of nothing. When Johnson finally steamed out of Midway, the Segundo was in a high state of material condition. It was August 10th, 1945, the day after the second atomic bomb was dropped. The crew knew that 2 Japanese cities had been destroyed by a powerful new weapon. What they did not know was that Fat Man and Little Boy were the reason Lockwood's subs had been withdrawn from the waters around Kyushu. Though the bombing's implications were unclear, the crew realized that the war was in its final stages. Nevertheless, they still believed Japan would have to be invaded before she surrendered. Indeed, Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, was set for November, less than 3 months away. Based on the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it promised to be a long, vicious fight. In the meantime, the Segundo headed for the Sea of Okhotsk, steering various courses at various speeds. Russia had declared war on Japan on August 8th, and though she was an American ally, the United States feared she might invade Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. Russia already had a foothold in the northern Kurils, and so the Segundo was sent to keep an eye on the Soviets. Imperial Japanese Navy warships and enemy freighters were strangely absent as the Segundo neared Japan. A few fishing trawlers were spotted, none worth stopping. The enemy might have been missing from the battlefield, but Johnson knew not to underestimate the Japanese. He had experienced firsthand how brave they could be. One time, while serving aboard a different vessel, Johnson had encountered a few Japanese soldiers floating on a raft in the middle of the Pacific. When he offered to take them on board, the bedraggled group surprised him by refusing. Despite being far from land, they preferred to die rather than surrender. After giving them food and water, Johnson obeyed their wishes and left them floating in the middle of nowhere. That small example of Japanese courage was enough to convince him they were a formidable foe. What American would wave off rescue in the face of certain death? You could only hope you would never be tested. While the Segundo was making her way up the coast of Japan, Kusaka surfaced the I-400. It was the evening of August 14th, and the I-401 was still missing. Time was running out as the attack date drew near, and Kusaka debated whether to wait or proceed on his own. It did not help that the I-400's radar was irreparably broken. The longer he hung around, the more chances he was taking. Kusaka was confident he had the right location. They had been relying on astral navigation to steer their course, but Takahashi had his doubts. He knew how difficult it was to navigate by the stars. As a pilot, he had experience making the same complicated calculations. The subs had practiced astral navigation at Nanao, and not once had their calculations been correct. Takahashi suspected they hadn't found the I-401 because somebody had made another miscalculation. In other words, they were lost. They were not lost, though. They were south of Ulithi, right where they should be. The longer Kusaka waited, the more likely it seemed that the I-401 had been sunk. The I-14 had nearly been lost while travelling to Truk, and the I-13 had disappeared 550 miles east of Yokosuka. Sunk by planes from the United States ship Anzio, CVE-57, as well as by the United States ship Lawrence C. Taylor, DE-415, the I-13's demise marked the Sixth Fleet's single largest loss of life during the war, and another casualty to ultra-intelligence. If the I-401 was also missing, then it meant Kusaka's sub was the last one left that could launch an attack. It was prudent for him to strike now rather than wait and risk being sunk. Takahashi thought along similar lines. If they did not rendezvous with the I-401 by the appointed time, they should attack on their own. Another reason to attack was the disturbing transmissions coming out of Sydney. A Japanese-language newscast aired by the Allies claimed that a special bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, instantly reducing the city to ruins. Takahashi was amazed to hear the bomb was no bigger than a matchbox. It sounded so fantastic, he was not sure whether to believe it. Other broadcasts mentioned that Russia had declared war on Japan. That meant 4 countries, the United States, Britain, China, and Russia, were demanding Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. Japan could not fight the entire world. Eventually, she would succumb. Many of the sub's officers doubted what they heard. One of Kusaka's men even reported hearing that Japan had won the war. The crew roared their approval and discussed what they would do once they arrived in America. But the more Takahashi listened, the more the newscasts rang true. One announcer claimed Japan would surrender if allowed to keep the emperor. It did not seem the kind of propaganda an enemy would spread. Gathering the I-400's pilots, Takahashi shared what he'd heard on the radio. Since no surrender had been declared, they agreed not to act rashly. If Japan did surrender, however, Takahashi wanted them to know they bore no responsibility for defeat. Whatever happened, they should remain calm. Still, the rumors were unnerving. The next day, Takahashi heard an Allied broadcast discussing repatriation. It claimed that Japanese soldiers will be allowed to return to their families to lead peaceful, productive lives. But it also stated that the crews of Japanese submarines will be punished as war criminals for the crime of massacring prisoners. Takahashi must have found the news unnerving, given his participation in the I-37 massacres. If captured, it meant he would be tried as a war criminal, another good reason to proceed with the attack. Rumors of an impending surrender spread quickly throughout the I-400. While Kusaka remained shut in his cabin, the sub entered a kind of purgatory. As time passed, the gossip increased, threatening to undermine discipline. When dawn arrived on the morning of August 15th, the I-400 submerged once again. It had been nearly 2 days since her arrival, with still no word from the flagship. Kusaka debated what to do. Should he wait one more day, or should he complete the mission on his own? After thinking matters over, he decided to wait a little longer. At dawn, Kusaka extended the I-400's radio antenna above the waves to test reception. Maybe 6th Fleet headquarters would send a message explaining the commander's whereabouts. Though radio reception was fine, there was no word from 6th Fleet. Then, at noon Tokyo time, the I-400 received a report from Japan. The broadcast was so shrouded in static, it seemed someone was trying to jam the signal. This was inconceivable, because the broadcast was made by the Emperor. No one on board the I-400 had ever heard the Emperor speak before. Indeed, no one in Japan, save the Emperor's closest advisors, had ever been addressed by the god incarnate, and certainly never by radio. As Takahashi listened to the Emperor, he found himself struggling to make sense of his words. The Emperor's voice was tinny and high-pitched, and his language was so vague and opaque, it was difficult to make sense of it. But when Takahashi heard the phrase, "endure the unendurable," he knew what it meant. The Emperor was telling them to lay down arms. When President Harry S. Truman announced that Japan had surrendered, Americans poured into the street to celebrate. When Emperor Hirohito announced his desire for peace, most Japanese were confused, particularly since he never used the word surrender. The announcement had been recorded the previous day on a phonograph record, but the Emperor's language was so formal and filled with vague allusions, it made comprehension difficult. Even the most educated Japanese had trouble understanding what he had said. There was confusion aboard the I-400 as well. Many officers could not believe Japan would surrender. The very concept of defeat was unimaginable, and their first reaction was to reject it. Kusaka, being a cooler character, was undecided. A transcript of the Emperor's speech was radioed to all Imperial Japanese Navy vessels that evening, and though it was easier to understand than the broadcast, it was still difficult. It was clear, however, that the Emperor believed the only way to prevent the Japanese race from being annihilated was to surrender. Peace had been declared. The Imperial rescript said nothing about the I-400's mission, though, and without specific orders, Kusaka could not stand down. Though he was a loyal subject, Kusaka did not report to the Emperor. He was under 6th Fleet command. That meant until the 6th Fleet, the Combined Fleet, or the Navy General Staff countermanded the I-400's orders, Kusaka would undertake the mission. If the I-401 did not arrive by August 17th, he would launch the attack himself. Unknown to Kusaka, or the 6th Fleet for that matter, the I-401 had not been sunk. She had arrived at the rendezvous point as planned. 30 minutes after sunset on the evening of August 14th, Nambu surfaced, looking for Kusaka. The night was clear and the water smooth, the stars shone brightly in the sky. Conditions were perfect for two subs to meet, yet the I-400 was nowhere to be seen. Nambu wondered whether the I-400 had succumbed to the same fate as the I-13. It was possible that a navigational error had caused the two subs to miss each other. Still, they could not be sure. The I-401 sent another friendly signal but received nothing in reply. Nambu was worried. The I-400 was waiting, of course, just not where she was supposed to be. When Arizumi ordered a course change, the agreed-upon meeting place had also been changed. He instructed the new location be radioed to the I-400, but either she never received the message or the I-401 failed to send it. Whatever the explanation, the I-400 was waiting in the waters off Ulithi, while the I-401 was waiting nearly 1,000 miles due west. It was a catastrophic error, and one that remains unexplained to this day. What is especially surprising is that Kusaka, if he never received the change order, should have been waiting in the waters off Ponape, yet that's not where he was. For some reason he had proceeded to Ulithi, bypassing Ponape altogether. This meant he not only failed to rendezvous with the I-401 at the new location, he went to Ulithi of his own accord. Gross failures in communication don't happen in a modern navy, at least not often and not on this scale. Additionally, there's no good reason why the two subs ended up in such different locations. Did Arizumi assume that Nambu would send Kusaka the change in plans? It seems unlikely, given how detail-oriented Arizumi was. Did Nambu deliberately withhold the route change in order to sabotage the mission? That seems even more unlikely, given Nambu's dedication to the Navy. Nambu does not recall Arizumi sending a message informing the I-400 of the new rendezvous. If this is the case, why did not Nambu send it in his stead? Either way, Kusaka never went to the original rendezvous point. He seems to have taken a right turn north of Ponape and headed straight for Ulithi on his own. It was an astounding breakdown in communication, one that probably saved the two subs from destruction. Of such errors is fate made. As the I-401 waited, she picked up newscasts out of San Francisco and Melbourne suggesting that surrender was imminent. From what Nambu could tell, the broadcasts were too outrageous to believe. He knew Japan was losing the war, but it never occurred to him she might actually surrender. He was truly shocked then by what the broadcasts claimed. The best explanation was that they were American propaganda devised to trick them. Nambu was not sure what Arizumi thought. The commander was keeping his mouth shut. Even if Arizumi knew something that he was not telling, he agreed to keep the radio broadcasts from the crew. Neither man wanted the mission jeopardized by unsubstantiated rumors, especially when they came from the enemy. Nambu ordered his radio officers to keep silent, but it is impossible to keep news quiet in a submarine. There are always crewmen who know how to ferret out information. Once word got out that Japan might surrender, it was all the men could talk about. When dawn approached on the morning of August 15th, Nambu wondered where his sister sub could be. Like Kusaka, he could not remain on the surface during daylight and had to decide whether to wait or attack Ulithi on his own. Finally, after discussion with Arizumi, he submerged the boat and waited until evening. If the I-400 did not show up by then, they would consider attacking Ulithi on their own. Time was running out. When Nambu resurfaced that evening, the I-400 was nowhere to be found. The weather was good, the ocean remained calm. The I-401's communications officer busily transcribed messages, hoping for news about the I-400. There was none, though, and foreign broadcasts continued to be alarming. It was still difficult for Nambu to take them seriously. Surrender seemed impossible. But when the communications chief handed him a transcript of the Emperor's broadcast, his hands shook in disbelief. Could they possibly be this stupid? he exclaimed. Then he barked, "Do not tell the crew." Arizumi was so infuriated he did not finish reading the Imperial rescript. Whether he already knew what it said or could not bear the news, Nambu was not sure. It made no difference either way. Both men were ready to attack. Orders from Japan followed quickly after that, though none of them made sense. One instructed the 631st Air Group to prepare a final defense of the Japanese homeland. Another confirmed that peace had been declared, but instructed all submarines to execute their predetermined missions and to attack the enemy if discovered. That was enough for Arizumi. He was finished waiting. The I-401 submerged and set a course for Ulithi. The Empire might have surrendered, but Arizumi had not. He was going to complete his mission. The I-401 was going rogue. Arizumi's decision to go rogue was not surprising. Even though the Emperor had expressed his desire for peace, only a ceasefire had been declared. An actual surrender agreement was still 3 weeks away. In the meantime, anything could happen, and the incoming messages were not helping. The orders Arizumi received were confusing and contradictory. Importantly, no order explicitly cancelled the Ulithi attack, let alone told him to stand down. In fact, one of the orders mentioned that submarines should execute their missions as planned. This meant the Ulithi attack was still on. Besides, Arizumi did not take commands from the Emperor, he took them from 6th Fleet. Since the 6th Fleet had not ordered him to cease combat operations, it was reasonable to assume the sub should proceed with her mission. It is also important to remember that Arizumi had been raised within the traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Born to a Navy family and educated at Etajima, he was a product of his upbringing. He had been a line commander, attended the Naval War College, and served as Naval General Staff Officer. Everything he believed in, worked for, and fought for was centered on serving the Imperial Japanese Navy. If Japan's cause was just, backed by celestial will and divine guidance, then it was his job to see that they triumphed. The word surrender was not in his vocabulary. There was also the problem of war crimes. Arizumi had played a central role in the Indian Ocean massacres. Allied protests had already resulted in his interrogation. Still, it is doubtful that Arizumi chose to continue the attack to avoid being tried as a war criminal. Annihilating prisoners might have been sickening, but he understood the reason for doing it. Besides, an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy never disobeyed an order, and Arizumi was dutiful if anything. Even if his decision to attack went against the Emperor's wishes, going out in a blaze of glory would be Arizumi's way of accepting responsibility for Japan's defeat. Fear of being prosecuted as a war criminal had nothing to do with it. Arizumi was a patriot. If the Emperor, in all his benevolence, had decided Japan must capitulate in order to survive, so be it. But Arizumi's honor was at stake, and honor is a powerful motivator in any culture. Yes, he'd sworn allegiance to the Emperor, but if Japan had failed after many years of war, the failure was Arizumi's. If victory was impossible, then his only recourse was death in defense of the Empire. It was the honorable thing to do. Nambu agreed with Arizumi. He too found surrender inconceivable, though he reacted as much out of anger as conviction, and they were not the only ones to feel this way. Acceptance of the ceasefire agreement was far from uniform in Japan. Approximately 600 military personnel, mostly officers, committed suicide over the disgrace. Others resisted in different ways. Most notable was the attempted coup d'état staged by Major Kenji Hatanaka on the evening of August 14th, designed to prevent the Emperor's speech from being broadcast. Hatanaka and his men stormed the imperial palace, searching feverishly for the phonograph record with the Emperor's recording. Though Hatanaka surrendered 4 hours before the Emperor's broadcast, the incident showed just how difficult it was for true believers to accept defeat, and Arizumi was a true believer. As commander of the last operational 6th Fleet unit, he was not willing to lay down his sword. He had been charged with a top-secret mission, the last offensive action of the war. When it came time to make his decision, Arizumi chose to proceed as planned. In 24 hours, they would launch against Ulithi. Masao Okui, the I-400's cook, knew something was wrong when the senior officers ignored their food. It was the evening of August 15th, and he was serving dinner in the wardroom. Food was a high point aboard the sub, so it was unusual when somebody refused to eat. The entire senior rank was so dispirited, they hardly lifted their hashi. Kusaka had chosen not to inform his enlisted men about the Emperor's announcement. It was the captain's prerogative to withhold information, but Kusaka did so because he was having trouble accepting the news himself. He had told his senior officers, of course, instructing them to keep quiet. Since orders from Japan were contradictory, he thought it best to see how things developed first. When the I-400 surfaced after sunset the next day, Kusaka finally received a message to cease combat activities and return to Kura. Instead of complying, he took the sub down to periscope depth and assembled his senior officers. Even though his orders were clear, their opinions still mattered to him. Losing the war was unprecedented. Kusaka wanted to know what his officers thought they should do. The I-400's chief navigator was first to speak. He argued they should attack Ulithi because it would be shameful to return to Japan. The I-400 was only hours from launching her Siran when the surrender announcement came. It would be easy to resume their plans. If they survived, they could launch other attacks against the enemy, commandeering food and fuel along the way. If capture appeared imminent, they could always scuttle the sub. Takahashi had the opposite reaction. The chief navigator was too quick to sacrifice the crew, he argued. Some of the officers might want to fight, but many of the enlisted men would want to go home. If the chief navigator wanted to die, fine, but why should the rest of the crew be deprived of their lives? Importantly, Japan had surrendered. What was the point of dying if they'd already lost? Of course, the naval command had made a grievous error. Starting a war it could not win had been foolish. Now that they had admitted defeat, everyone should return home as quickly as possible. Kusaka listened quietly with his eyes closed. When all his officers had had their say, he retired to his cabin to think things over. It did not take him long to make up his mind. He soon reassembled his officers to tell them they were returning to Kura. Though not everyone agreed with the choice, some officers even contemplated jumping into the sea wearing weights if they were captured, there was palpable relief. Kusaka informed the rest of the crew by intercom. Many were surprised by Japan's defeat, but they were equally shocked to have survived the war. Takahashi was in the happy-to-return-home camp. At least he would not be throwing his life away to satisfy someone else's notion of honor. The next morning, Kusaka set course for Japan. It's unknown whether he feared capture because he had massacred prisoners, but he certainly took precautions. Traveling underwater by day, Kusaka surfaced only at night, when the sub could go her fastest. Obviously, no self-respecting sub-captain wanted to surrender his boat to the enemy. The ignominy could only be worsened by being captured in international waters. Ideally, they would make it back to Japan without being spotted, where they could quietly melt into the countryside. If worse came to worst and they were intercepted, it had to be in Japanese waters. Otherwise, the loss of face would be too great. The I-14 was awaiting another recon patrol when Shimizu received a transcript of the Emperor's speech. He had his doubts about the message, just like the other sub-captains. He even considered sailing to Singapore as originally planned. But when the I-14 was ordered to cease combat operations, Shimizu gathered his officers and read them the edict. Lieutenant Michio Takamatsu, the I-14's gunnery officer, was crushed by the news. This was how German naval officers must have felt at the end of World War I, he thought. Germany had paid a heavy price after the war, and Takamatsu feared the same for Japan. Shogunai, he said to himself, there was nothing he could do. Some of Shimizu's officers entertained wild ideas, like blowing up the sub or attacking Saipan. When the 6th Fleet ordered the I-14 to return to Yokosuka, Shimizu finally accepted that the war was over. The news might have depressed him, but he was ready to comply. It was time to go home. As the I-14 departed Truk, one of its reconnaissance planes circled overhead. Though he accepted the ceasefire, Shimizu was intent on avoiding capture. Navigating underwater by day, he darkened the I-14's navigation lights when traveling on the surface at night. His priority was to bring every last crewman safely back to the mainland. The only way to do it was to avoid the enemy. Meanwhile, tempers were running hot in Fukuyama. Some of the 631st's younger officers wanted to commandeer a boat, pack it with weapons, and attack Allied ships in the Tsushima Strait. It was a joke at first. Then Lieutenant Yamamoto found a boat, loaded it with supplies, and headed for the inland sea with a few supporters. Things did not end there, however. The air group's maintenance chief was so upset by the Emperor's broadcast, he threatened suicide. Thinking more clearly, he packed his bags and deserted the unit instead. His colleagues took mercy on him since his Hiroshima home had recently been destroyed. 2 men went to bring him back. The incident was indicative of the difficulty many had embracing defeat. The I-401's Siran were readying for their attack on Ulithi when Nambu received orders to cease all combat activity. The blanket message was quickly followed by another specifically cancelling the Ulithi mission. Submarine Squadron 1 was now ordered to Kura. It was 9 o'clock the evening of August 16th when Nambu learned the attack had been cancelled. The order had come not a moment too soon, since the sub was close to launching her planes. Had the message arrived 7 hours later, an attack so provocative it could have endangered the ceasefire agreement would have commenced. As it was, the I-401 barely avoided disaster. There were no rules in the Japanese Navy for dealing with surrender. The samurai code taught that when given a choice between surrender and death, it is best to choose death. Imperial naval tradition reinforced this thinking, but Nambu was too relieved to annihilate himself. It might have been cowardly, still he was glad to be alive. After receiving orders to stand down, Arizumi convened a meeting in the I-401's wardroom with Nambu and his senior officers in attendance. It had been nearly 2 days since the Emperor's announcement, a seeming eternity in the minds of those who knew the truth. Now, as they squeezed around the wardroom table, their faces shiny with sweat, the officers of the I-401 expressed their opinion about what to do next. "We cannot return to Japan with our tail between our legs," one officer argued. "We should scuttle the sub instead." Arizumi dismissed the idea. German captains who scuttled their ships at the end of World War I had demonstrated admirable fighting spirit, he explained, but their actions had resulted in higher war reparations for Germany. The commander did not want to increase Japan's burden, especially after losing a war. Instead, he suggested they annihilate themselves. "Even if we return to the mainland, all soldiers will be executed as war criminals," he added. Mass suicide was a better idea. Individual accounts of the meeting vary, but Nambu's officers had little heart for such drastic action. "Even if we commit suicide, we only have 6 pistols," one officer pointed out. "Senior officers have a sword, but their death would be messy and might discourage the enlisted men from following their example. It's just not practical for 200 people to annihilate themselves. Sinking the sub would be better, even if it burdens Japan." Arizumi continued to disagree. He might not have realized, however, that some of his officers preferred not to die by their own hand. Though they were ashamed to admit it, it created a dilemma. If a consensus emerged that suicide was best, the reluctant officers would be obligated to go along. In the meantime, many hoped to avoid death by coming up with an alternative solution. One officer suggested they hide out on a Pacific island. The idea was dismissed as impractical because they could not survive on an island without supplies. Another officer, desirous of breaking the tension, suggested they become pirates. With 3 attack planes, 20 torpedoes, and months' worth of provisions, they could sail the high seas, capturing ships along the way. It was a funny idea, and no one took it seriously. If Nambu felt anything during the meeting, it was the shame of defeat. It was bad enough that Japan had lost the war. The fact she had surrendered was enough to choke him. But the more Nambu thought about the situation, the more he realized what he should do. The Emperor had called upon Japan's fighting men to return and rebuild their nation. Perhaps they should heed that call. Certainly their lives would be better spent helping their country recover from a devastating war than sacrificing themselves for a cause already lost. It was at this moment that Nambu decided what he must do. The war was over. The Emperor had deemed it so. He would return his 204 crewmen safely to Japan. And since the 6th Fleet was no longer in existence, there was no one to tell him to do otherwise, no one except Arizumi. It was hard to know where the commander stood after the debate. After all, His first instinct had been for everyone to annihilate themselves. Would he back a consensus to return to Japan, or would he overrule them? There was no way to know for sure. After the initial wardroom meeting, Muneo Bando, the I-401's chief navigator, went to Arizumi's quarters for a private audience. Like many of the I-401's officers, Bando was relieved the war was over. Newly married, he was inclined to accept the Emperor's edict. "Commander, regarding suicide," Bando began. "You were not at the meeting, but I think suicide is the best choice for us." "What do we do about the submarine, Commander, if we commit suicide?" "We will leave the sub afloat, so it won't cause problems for Japan in the future." It was now or never, so Bando screwed up his courage. "There is no need to go to these lengths, that is, annihilate ourselves. We have fought for the Emperor, but this time the Emperor has ordered our submission. Committing suicide against his wish may mean death for nothing. We should follow orders and return to base." "Do you think so?" Arizumi asked. No such opinion was expressed in the meeting. "Commander, we need to think about the future of the Japanese race. It took Germany only 10 years to recover from World War I. You devoted half your life to the Navy, but I and the crew are young. You may have no regrets, still." Bando stopped talking to examine the commander's face. Much to Bando's surprise, Arizumi seemed to be taking what he said seriously. Sensing an opportunity, Bando pressed on. "We must be the ones to rebuild Japan. Why not sail the sub to an unpopulated part of the eastern seaboard, split up and disappear? That way we could arrive home safely and avoid surrendering to the Americans. If the enemy intercepts us, we can always submerge with the hatches open. Barring capture, we should try to get home no matter what." Yata, the I-401's gunnery officer, was not senior enough to have been told of the Emperor's announcement when it first happened. Now that he knew, he was glad the war was over. Nobody had thought they could win anyway, so it was a relief to hear they might be returning home. But could the I-401 really get through such heavily guarded waters? Yata wondered. Surely the United States would catch them along the way. What would they do then? Bando's suggestion to return to Japan was the simplest, most direct response to an ambiguous situation, but the problem of how to avoid capture by the Americans remained. If they were discovered while too far south, they might be diverted to an American naval base like Saipan or Guam. Alternatively, they could not head for Yokosuka or Kure, because both were likely to be occupied. Fortunately, their classified mission gave them options. The I-401 was a top-secret sub. Few people knew she existed. This meant they could go anywhere they wanted, and nobody would be the wiser. Being a well-kept secret had its advantage. Alternative accounts suggest that the idea to return to Japan was not Bando's alone. Whatever the truth, the consensus was fragile. There had been so much back and forth and so many conflicting opinions that Nambu was not sure which agreement would stick. The commander had always been difficult, and his sense of pride naturally favoured death. Surprisingly, Arizumi agreed to return to Japan. They would continue travelling underwater by day to escape detection, even though such an act was considered hostile. They would avoid Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo. Instead, they would head for the Sanriku coast, a remote area on Honshu's northeastern seaboard that the enemy was likely to overlook. Once they arrived, they would disembark and quietly scuttle the sub. Since few people knew the I-401 existed, let alone her whereabouts, they might just get away with it. The two wild cards were the Americans and Arizumi. Unfortunately, there was nothing Nambu could do about either one. If they ran into the enemy, all bets were off. He just hoped it did not come to that. When Nambu finally informed his crew that Japan had lost the war, it was nearly 30 hours since the Emperor had broadcast the same message. Many had guessed the truth. Certainly no one complained about not having been told. They were happy just to have survived. The crew might have been glad to be alive, but their mood was hardly festive. A depression descended upon the sub and deepened the farther north they got. The shock of having survived the war was replaced by the uncertainty of what awaited them at home. Were their families still alive, or had they been incinerated by B-29s? Would they be welcomed back, scorned as ghosts or worse, seen as responsible for the Empire's defeat? After so many years of warfare, the men had difficulty grasping a future that did not involve death. The uncertainty of post-war life weighed on them like a black cloud. Nambu received a second imperial rescript on August 18th, this one addressed to the officers and men of the imperial forces. 3 years and 8 months have elapsed since we declared war on the United States and Britain. During this time, our beloved men of the Army and Navy, sacrificing their lives, have fought valiantly on disease-stricken and barren lands and on tempestuous waters in the blazing sun, and of this we are deeply grateful. Now that the Soviet Union has entered the war against us, to continue the war under the present internal and external conditions would be only to increase needlessly the ravages of war, finally to the point of endangering the very foundation of the empire's existence. With that in mind, and although the fighting spirit of the Imperial Army and Navy is as high as ever, with a view to maintaining and protecting our noble national policy, we are about to make peace with the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and Chongqing. To a large number of loyal and brave officers and men of the imperial forces who have died in battle, and from sicknesses goes our deepest grief. At the same time, we believe the loyalty and achievements of you officers and men of the imperial forces will for all time be the quintessence of our nation. We trust that you officers and men of the imperial forces will comply with our intention and will maintain a solid unity and strict discipline in your movements, and that you will bear the hardest of all difficulties, bear the unbearable, and leave an everlasting foundation of the nation. Nambu had little difficulty understanding this rescript. Enough time had passed that he had accepted Japan's defeat, and the edict, though sad, was designed to persuade the military to accept a ceasefire. Not everybody was content to surrender, though. 2 days later, the I-401 received a message not only diverting her from Kure to Ominato, but demanding she reveal her position as well. The request put Arizumi in a quandary. If he revealed the I-401's location, the sub could be directed to an enemy port. As a soldier of the Imperial Navy, I cannot let one of His Majesty's ships fall into enemy hands, he told Nambu. There is no need to give them our location. We will just keep silent and return to the mainland. Clearly, Arizumi was still in command. Deciding to attack Ulithi after the Emperor's broadcast, returning to a port of his own choosing, and now refusing to reveal the sub's location were strong indications he was no longer following orders. It was remarkable in some ways that a loyal commander of the Sixth Fleet, one who had consented to massacring prisoners even though he knew the policy was despicable, behaved in this manner. Then again, they were living in remarkable times. Arizumi was calling the shots. A third imperial rescript, also addressed to the military, was received on August 25. Written to suppress the pockets of resistance that continued to plague the empire, the emperor again thanked his fighting men for their sacrifice, reminded them to cease combat activity, and made it clear that demobilization was underway. The Navy minister followed up the rescript with his own message. Praising the emperor's gracious edict, it reminded Imperial Japanese Navy personnel to follow the emperor's words and focus their efforts on rebuilding the nation. By now, the message was clear. The war was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no more. Nambu took the messages as evidence that he was correct in returning his crew to Japan. After posting an inspirational note to the I-401's mast, he retired to his cabin to pen his last poem of the war. Let this disgrace be handed down and shared by our children and grandchildren as it becomes a cornerstone of our homeland. Later that night, Nambu shaved off his moustache. He felt no regret doing so, though it surprised his crew. He'd been growing the moustache since before hostilities began, and its loss was his way of saying the war was over. The crew understood Nambu's action. They also grasped his intention to return them home safely. No words need be spoken. The loss of his moustache said volumes. Travelling on the surface both day and night, Nambu raced home to Japan. On August 26th, all Imperial Japanese Navy warships were instructed to dispose of their weapons and hoist the black flag of surrender. Nambu had all documents collected in keeping with the order. Everything from the important to the mundane, including the sub's logbooks, codebooks, personal diaries, schematics and navigation charts, was loaded into jute sacks and weighted with ammunition. Then, as the midday sun shone overhead, the crew began throwing bag after bag off the machine gun deck. Nambu watched the sacks splash into the Kuroshio current. The water was so clear he could trace each bag as it sank into the darkness. Weapons disposal left Yata in a state of shock. As gunnery officer, nothing was worse than throwing munitions over the side. It made him feel numb. Inouye, the I-401's sonar operator, was similarly moved. Chucking weapons overboard was such a painful reminder of defeat that he found himself crying. Nambu waited until dark before disposing of their Siran. The moon was playing hide-and-seek behind the clouds as the first airplane was rolled from the hangar. The aircrew left her wings folded, attached the plane to the catapult without floats, and launched her pilotless into the night sky. The first Siran did not get very far before plunging into the sea. Rather than sink right away, she settled so slowly it seemed as if she were putting up a fight. Nambu thought it the saddest sight he'd ever seen. Heiji Kondo was the aircraft mechanic responsible for the second plane. He felt nothing but respect for his charge. As a result, he could not let her leave with a United States star on her wings. It would be embarrassing if someone found her. Besides, Kondo wanted everyone to know the Siran had been a Japanese plane. Working quickly in the darkness, he and his maintenance crew painted over the blue and white star with a bright red Japanese sun. When they were finished, they launched their Siran into the night, tears shining in their eyes. Arizumi accompanied the launch of each Siran with a lone cry of "Banzai!" It only added to the tragic effect. But something strange happened that night. As the third Siran hurtled down the launch ramp, the plane seemed to resist leaving. A rooster tail of sparks followed in her wake, and after crashing into the ocean, she floated so close to the I-401 that Kondo felt she was trying to return home. It was a sentimental notion, but it did not last. After struggling to remain afloat, the final Siran dipped beneath the waves. The storm that had once been intended for a clear sky vanished into the night. The I-400 also disposed of its weapons. Surfacing shortly after sunset, Kusaka's crew began throwing sacks of documents overboard. Among them were Takahashi's personal flight records. It pained him to throw them away. But since they tied him to the I-37's massacre of Allied prisoners, he had no choice. Next came the Siran. A brief ceremony was held before the planes were launched. The air crews lined up on the machine gun deck, tears running down their cheeks, before they punched holes in their plane's wings and fuselage. Next, the I-400's crane picked up the planes, one by one, and dropped them into the ocean. Even in darkness, the Siran's silver-painted body could be seen sinking slowly out of sight. It hurt to see such good aircraft destroyed. Still, Takahashi knew that disguising the planes as American would be seen as a violation of international law. But the I-400 was not home free yet. Amid all the hurried activity, a crewman fell overboard and drowned. It was shocking to lose someone so close to Japan, especially now that the war was over. The accident did not stop weapons disposal, though. There was no time for delay. Siran ordnance came next. One by one, the 1,760-pound bombs were plucked off the deck and dropped into the sea. Okui, the cook, was sad to see the weapons go, but not as sad as the sub's chief torpedo officer over what happened next. After launching the I-400's bow torpedoes, Kusaka watched in dismay as one by one they leaped out of the water, turned in a half-circle, and began heading back toward the boat. It took only one malfunctioning torpedo to sink a submarine. Several was unprecedented. Clearly the gyros had been set incorrectly. Incredible as it may seem, after surviving an Allied air raid, underwater mines, an electrical fire and multiple Navy task forces, the hunter was once again the hunted. Only this time, the I-400 was not hunted by the enemy. She was hunting herself. Carlo Carlucci was asleep when news of the Japanese surrender first reached the Segundo. He had finished his watch, had a bite to eat, and was sacked out in the crew's quarters when somebody turned the lights on. "What's up?" he asked drowsily. "War is over," someone shouted. Carlucci could not have been more surprised. The Segundo was en route to the Kuril Islands when Japan accepted peace terms. It was 2:07 the afternoon of August 15th when the news came by radio. 43 minutes later it was followed by Commander, Submarine Force, United States Pacific Fleet orders to cease fire. As late as July 1945, United States submariners were repeating the hopeful slogan, "The Golden Gate in 48, so it's clear they thought fighting would last at least a little while longer. But the absence of enemy ships was one indication the war was near its end. The Segundo had seen nothing since leaving Midway. Still, as Captain Johnson approached their designated patrol area, he resolved to stay on guard. The Japanese might have accepted a ceasefire, but he knew how determined they could be. They would have to be careful. The Kurils are a long chain of islands extending in an arc northeast from Hokkaido to the Russian peninsula of Sredini Krebet. Long contested, the islands were an uneasy mix of both populations. Russia had begun invading the chain 3 days after the ceasefire had been declared. The Kurils may have been economically insignificant, but they had strategic value, since they could be used to launch an attack against Japan. The Segundo patrolled the area for 7 days. From what Johnson could tell, the Japanese were sitting out the Russian land grab. Given the animosity between the two countries, it must have hurt. Nevertheless, Johnson's orders were to observe, not to intervene. On August 19th, the Segundo approached close enough to photograph one of the islands. Seeing no activity, Johnson withdrew. That same day, he stopped a Japanese fishing trawler. Deciding she was not a threat, he let her go. It was a waste to interdict fishermen, and now that a ceasefire had been declared, he had no reason to sink one. In fact, Johnson became so confident, the Segundo remained surfaced by day, diving only when torpedo maintenance was necessary. The Segundo was not alone on her patrol. The United States ship Razorback was also in the area. The subs exchanged recognition signals and small talk, killing time until something more interesting came their way. Then finally, on August 24th, Johnson was ordered south to Tokyo Bay. The Segundo was told to mop up any remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy that were encountered along the way. There had been enough isolated attacks since the ceasefire to warrant concern. The official surrender ceremony had even been pushed back a few days to give the Japanese military time to persuade reluctant factions to lay down arms. Any more violations and the ceasefire might be jeopardized. Johnson knew enough to maintain a sharp lookout, but he probably did not expect any strays. Japanese warships were not anticipated this far north, and if he did see anything, it was likely to be a small surface vessel, since most capital ships had been sunk. But not all Japanese warships had been destroyed. The world's largest, most secret submarine was returning home, determined that nothing should get in her way. What Johnson did not realize was that the Segundo stood right in her path. The I-401 was considerably lighter after jettisoning her weapons. She now rode higher in the water than at any time since training. Her increased buoyancy also meant she travelled faster, a condition Nambu exploited in his race to get home. For the last 2 days, the I-401 had been making her way up Japan's eastern seaboard. They had managed to avoid the enemy thus far. But one dark night, when visibility was poor, they had a bad scare. They were still south of Tokyo when one of the lookouts spotted a shadow in the distance. There was little chance of it being a Japanese ship given all the enemy activity, so Nambu submerged, hoping to escape detection. As the I-401's crew sat motionless, the sound of a United States Navy task force roared overhead. It would have been an excellent opportunity to attack if Nambu had not already disposed of their weapons. When the propellers faded, Nambu resurfaced. He could still see the huge black shadows heading toward Japan. Ironically, it was the same direction he was heading in, only he was not a conqueror as they were, he was a fugitive. The difference was incalculable. Avoiding capture was only one of Nambu's problems. The other was Arizumi's increasingly erratic behavior. Just as the Segundo's crew was watching Captain Johnson for signs of trigger happiness, Nambu watched Arizumi for signs of trouble. Nambu no longer feared being dead in battle, and he was well aware that his commander had volunteered them for suicide. Since then, however, Arizumi's strange behavior had made him feel ill at ease. Nambu's greatest fear was that the command structure was breaking down. The Siran pilots had lapsed into a kind of despondency, and the rest of the crew was equally depressed. If morale collapsed, they could be in danger. It took only one mistake for a fatal accident to sink a submarine. Nambu had to find a way to keep that from happening. Arizumi's behavior was not helping matters. It was shocking to see him look so poorly. The normally stout squadron commander seemed to have shrunk to half his normal size, and his clean-shaven face only emphasized the change. Even some of the I-401's officers did not recognize him. After entering the wardroom, the I-401's sonar operator thought, "Who is that sitting there?" Then he realized, it is the boss. It must have been devastating for Arizumi to see his world collapse around him. He had single-mindedly served two things in his life, the Emperor and the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now both had ordered him to surrender. To make matters worse, he was returning home not only in defeat, but as a war criminal. No wonder death was an appealing solution. Arizumi's travails were far from over. As they neared Japan, he'd felt safe enough to report the I-401's location. However, the Imperial Defense Command had forwarded the information to the United States Navy as part of the armistice agreement. It was the ultimate betrayal by the very system Arizumi had pledged to support. Fortunately, Arizumi had no way of knowing this, otherwise he might have taken precipitate action. In the meantime, he struggled to live within a code that fate had conspired to destroy. The truth must have been enough to drive him crazy. By the evening of August 28th, the I-401 was less than 200 miles off the coast of Japan. In 10 hours, they would reach the Sanriku coast, their final destination. As it was, they were passing Kinkasan, a mountainous island northeast of Tokyo. Bando fantasized about evacuating the sub. In the ancient past, gold had been discovered nearby, and good fortune came to those who visited the local shrine. But the I-401 continued its journey. In addition to raising the black surrender flag, Nambu had also angled the deck guns downward to indicate they were not hostile. The I-401 may have appeared chastened, but neither Nambu nor Arizumi was willing to hand their sub to the enemy just yet. It was miraculous that Nambu had gotten this far without being apprehended. In a sea brimming with enemy ships, it was virtually impossible to evade capture. Now, with his objective only 10 hours away, Nambu imagined he could safely return his men to Japan, if luck would only hold. "Something black! 15 degrees to starboard!" a lookout shouted. "Movement unknown!" It was near midnight when a silhouette unmistakably formed into a United States submarine. Radar officer Natsume confirmed he had a ship on his screen. "We cannot dive to escape," Nambu thought. "They will see it as an act of aggression." The last thing he wanted, now that the war was over, was to lose his crew in a meaningless action. But he did not want to be captured either, and so in what amounted to an act of wishful thinking, Nambu decided upon swift withdrawal. Ordering a change in course, he felt the sub veer hard to port and accelerate to flank speed. As he watched the enemy fall away 90 degrees to starboard, he prayed they had escaped without being discovered. Unfortunately for the crew of the I-401, Nambu's luck had finally run out. The sub rocked gently on the surface as dawn spread across the Pacific. The sea was calm, the day grey and hazy. As Nambu watched the American sub less than 500 yards off his starboard side, he did not need binoculars to see that her torpedo tubes were pointed directly at him. The confrontation had a rallying effect on the commander. Restored to his intransigent self, Arizumi stood beside the I-401's captain, staring grimly at the Americans. Nambu requested an update on port engine repairs. Informed it would take a while longer, he reviewed his options. As best as he could determine, he had 3, all of them bad. They could fight, they could run, or they could surrender. Yata, the chief gunnery officer, wanted to ram the American submarine. Nambu dismissed the idea, since they'd never close the distance before being torpedoed. In fact, attacking the sub was impossible. They had disposed of all their weapons 2 days earlier. The Americans did not know this, of course, which meant Nambu could leverage their ignorance. But he was not ready for a banzai charge, at least not yet, which left 2 other options, running or surrendering. Both were unappealing. As Nambu watched his enemy, the American sub flashed another signal. This one said, "Surrender." Stop was one thing, surrender quite another. The I-401 might have been flying the black flag, but Arizumi had no intention of honoring it. Asamura had been sleeping when the Segundo first appeared. Word of the American sub quickly spread, and though there was no panic, the crew was worried. Fearful of death, a young crewman sought Asamura out for reassurance. "We will die together, won't we?" The young man's concern was indicative of the fear some felt inside the I-401. Many of the enlisted men expected to die, if not at the hands of the Americans, then at the hands of their commander. After all, everyone knew Arizumi had massacred Allied prisoners. Their treatment at the hands of the enemy would be no different. Some men were convinced Arizumi would never permit that to happen. He would annihilate them first, either by scuttling the sub or by ordering them to commit suicide. Either way, they were doomed. While the crew wondered what was happening, Nambu carefully watched the Segundo. He had a bad feeling about the sub. Her intention to sink them seemed clear. Given his limited options, Nambu figured it was best to do nothing. A passive-aggressive approach might buy time to develop a course of action. He would wait them out. Unfortunately for Nambu, Captain Johnson was in no mood for stalling. He had been granted permission to torpedo the enemy if they showed resistance. The Japanese sub might have been flying the surrender flag, but nothing in her behavior indicated she would do so. The Segundo's crew knew their captain would not hesitate to sink the enemy. They might have been more worried, however, had they known his real intention. For Johnson was not going to sink the I-401, at least not yet. He was going to try to board her first. The I-401's chief navigator, Muneo Bando, was standing near Captain Nambu on the bridge when they received a signal from the American sub to dispatch an officer. "Send an officer," Bando thought. "What do they mean, send an officer? They should send someone to us." Even in the middle of a showdown, Sixth Fleet pride took precedence. Nambu tried a different approach. Instead of refusing the request, he signalled, "We have no boat." This was not true, of course. Kondo, the Siran mechanic, was busy preparing a rubber raft for just such a request. But Nambu was reluctant to comply with the order. The longer he dragged things out, the more options he might have. Though he did not want to be torpedoed, he was not going to cooperate just because they'd asked. In the meantime, Captain Johnson was losing patience. "Tell them we will send a boat," he snapped. Now that the Segundo had called their bluff, Arizumi needed to appoint someone to represent them. Regulations stipulated that in such situations, the chief navigator should serve as liaison, but Bando's English was poor. Nevertheless, Arizumi wanted him to go. "This is asking a lot, but please visit the enemy submarine," Arizumi requested. "We have no intention of living ourselves, and I do not know what will happen to you amongst the enemy, but think of this as your final duty and go." Arizumi had always liked Bando, even though some crewmen considered him a brown-noser. Still, the navigator was able to say things to the commander that Nambu could never get away with. Bando agreed to act as liaison, but that did not mean he had the authority to negotiate. The most he could do was communicate the commander's wishes and relay the American response. He did not have the power to accept or change terms. That was Arizumi's call. The biggest problem Bando faced was his weak command of the enemy's language. Arizumi knew Bando was deficient and questioned him about it. "Can you handle them all right with your English?" he asked. "Why don't you bring along a crew member who can translate for you?" Arizumi was probably thinking of Masao Nishimura, a Canadian-born Nisei who spoke fluent English. Nishimura had monitored the English-language broadcasts aboard the I-401. His command of the language was excellent, but Bando did not want an English speaker. He was concerned that a translator might inadvertently say something he shouldn't, or somehow take control of the negotiations. Importantly, Bando thought it best if the Americans did not understand everything he was saying. Obscurity could help in a situation where they had few advantages. If anything, he might be able to wear down the Americans enough that they'd grant a concession. It would not be the first time the Japanese had used such a tactic. "I cannot let the enemy see our hand," Bando replied. "I will handle this myself." Bando felt responsibility for their situation. After all, he had convinced Arizumi not to scuttle the sub. Staying alive had made sense at the time, since they still had options. Now that they might become prisoners, he was not so sure. The obligation to bring matters to an honourable conclusion weighed heavily upon him, nor did it help that he entertained thoughts of survival. If the Americans could be persuaded to allow the I-401 to continue on her own, Bando felt he could prevent Arizumi from scuttling the sub. But if they refused or negotiations broke down, all bets were off. In that case, Bando was prepared to die. The Segundo sent a small rubber raft to collect Bando. Manned by Lieutenant Junior Grade J.K. Brozo and rowed by Chief of the boat E.A. Russell, it took the two men 15 minutes to maneuver the craft near the giant submarine. Entering a raft in a choppy sea is not an elegant process, and Bando undoubtedly got wet. Wearing shorts, a long-sleeved coat, and a short-brimmed hat, he sat in the stern, practically in Lieutenant Brozo's lap. As Russell pulled away from the I-401, the wind picked up and the sea with it. It took another 15 minutes to return to the Segundo. During this time, Bando sat quietly in the raft, fearful about what might happen next. He was about to board an American submarine outmanned, outgunned, and far from help. The fate of the I-401 rested upon his shoulders. He did not want the crew to die in vain, but if it came to that, he was not going without a fight. If the enemy sank them, he resolved to give the American captain a farewell punch in the jaw. By the time the raft bumped against the Segundo's hull, Bando was seriously scared. When he saw the reception party, 5 crewmen each with a pistol waiting to search him, he realized the Americans considered him unpredictable. They need not have worried. Bando had every intention of conducting himself in a manner becoming an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, even with a .45 stuck in his back. Johnson was waiting on the bridge. Wearing a dark navy jacket and his lieutenant commander's hat, he maintained a casual pose as the navigator greeted him. "I am Bando," Bando said. He followed his broken English with a Japanese-style bow. "Hello, Mr. Bando," Johnson replied. "Nice to meet you." He then shook the navigator's hand, albeit awkwardly. Formalities finished, Johnson cut to the chase. "You surrender." "Look at my submarine," Bando responded, uncertain of his English. "We not surrender, we harakiri." Captain Johnson looked concerned. "Harakiri no good," he replied. Bando was surprised that an American sub-captain would know the word harakiri. Johnson had even used it in his reply, leaving no doubt he understood what the ritual act of suicide meant. Bando smiled inwardly. If Captain Johnson did not want the Japanese crew to annihilate themselves, it gave him negotiating leverage. He could use suicide as a threat to extract concessions from his foe. That, combined with the possibility the Americans did not know the sub had disarmed, meant they were in a stronger negotiating position than he originally realized. As the conversation progressed, the mood remained hostile. Johnson told Bando he wanted the Japanese sub to proceed to Yokosuka accompanied by the Segundo. Bando refused, claiming the I-401 had only enough fuel to reach Ominato. Johnson did not buy Bando's story. Yokosuka was closer than Ominato. The I-401 should have no trouble reaching the sub-base. The truth was, Arizumi did not want to surrender at an occupied naval base. He found it too humiliating. Nevertheless, Johnson had orders to escort the I-401 to Yokosuka whether they liked it or not. If Johnson was surprised to be negotiating with a junior officer, he did not show it. Bando might have had less authority than Nambu, but Johnson seemed content to deal with him. Despite a somewhat flippant manner, the Segundo's captain remained calm throughout the discussion. He knew the Japanese were in no position to negotiate. The Segundo had them at gunpoint, but Johnson was willing to hear them out, so long as he was not played for a fool. At the end of the day, they would do what he said, or he would blow them out of the water. It was as simple as that. Bando, however, proved difficult to understand. As the Segundo's patrol report indicates, a doubtful conversation was held in baby talk plus violent gestures. It is dangerous to negotiate with a foe you don't completely comprehend. The cultural gap was wide enough, but the language barrier was almost insurmountable. Despite the difficulty in communicating, the Segundo's captain remained in control. Slouching against the bridge, his lieutenant commander's hat tipped back on his forehead, Johnson towered over the Japanese navigator. He might not have realized that Bando did not have the authority to negotiate, especially since the chief navigator was negotiating with all his might. Nevertheless, Bando appeared almost comical. Aside from being small, he seemed exotic and out of place. Handing him a map, Johnson pointed to where he wanted the Japanese sub to go. Yokosuka, he said. Even Bando could understand that. But the chief navigator had other ideas. When he had first climbed aboard the American sub, he was sure they were going to annihilate him. But Johnson had no more intention of annihilating Bando than he did of allowing the I-401's crew to commit suicide. Perhaps there was an honourable alternative. If so, Bando was determined to find it. Using pidgin English, Bando tried persuading the Segundo's commanding officer to let them go to Ominato. If he did, Bando promised, they would turn their sub over as soon as they arrived. If Johnson insisted on the I-401 surrendering, however, they would have no choice but to commit harakiri. Johnson shook his head. At this point in the discussion, a Segundo quartermaster pulled a Kabar combat knife from his belt and held it in front of Bando. "Here, take this," he said. "I have never seen someone commit harakiri before." Then, to emphasize the point, he shouted down the bridge hatch, "Send up a bucket of water. We are going to have a mess up here." The story may be apocryphal, since the crewman who reported it was not on the bridge at the time, but it was indicative of the sour feelings that many of the crew felt for the Japanese. There might have been a ceasefire, but the war was not over, not by a long shot, and these Japanese seemed intent on restarting it. Johnson hung tough despite his crew's doubts. Arguing that suicide would be meaningless now that the war was over, he told Bando the best thing to do was surrender and accompany him to Yokosuka. "I would like you to persuade your people of this," he urged Bando. "There is no point in annihilating yourselves." Bando did not understand everything the American sub-captain said. Still, he sensed the man felt responsible for keeping them alive. "They won't commit suicide before I return," Bando said. "So please don't worry. The important thing is the result of our negotiation." But Bando was wrong. Unknown to the chief navigator, Arizumi's patience had run out. Determined not to surrender his flagship, the commander had grown so agitated he ordered signal flags to be used to send Bando a message. It read, "Tell them to hurry up and sink our sub." Bando was astonished. He had boarded the American sub, eager to save his crewmates. Now Arizumi was telling him to facilitate their death. "Please wait, we are negotiating," Bando signalled back. As far as Arizumi was concerned, it was too late. The negotiations had gone on long enough. If the Americans would not torpedo Arizumi's sub, allowing him an honourable death, then he would take matters into his own hands. "Open the Kingston valves," he commanded. Arizumi would sink his flagship himself.